Today on the Perception in Action podcast, re-examining the causes of performance failures under pressure. Is focusing attention on skill execution really the main culprit? What roles do cognitive overload and distraction play? Are there flaws in the experimental evidence? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to revisit the topic of choking under pressure, specifically focusing on the role attention plays in this phenomenon. Back in episode 11, I laid out the basic story. The bulk of research has shown that performing poorly under pressure is associated with increased self-consciousness, which leads to turning attention inwards towards skill execution. Today, in part one of this two-part series, I want to dig a bit deeper, focusing on some of the challenges and critiques to this idea that have been recently put forth. In the second part of the series, I will look at some integrative theories that have been proposed which attempt to resolve the conflicting views in this area. But before I do any of that, I want to review the different attentional theories of choking and highlight some important things that I think are often misunderstood. As I discussed in episode 11, the attentional theories of choking have traditionally been divided into two camps: the turn inwards camp versus the turn outwards camp. The inwards theories argue that performance anxiety causes an athlete to somehow disrupt the automatic components of the action by consciously attending to and controlling their movements. This results in skill execution that is disjointed and includes discrete transition points where errors can be introduced. This idea was first proposed by Roy Baumeister in 1984. There are three different ways this has been proposed to occur. First, what we might call self-monitoring theory. This theory proposes that pressure induces an internal focus of attention. Second, what I'll call execution-focused theory proposes that pressure leads a performer to use top-down attentional processes to execute the components of the skill through step-by-step explicit control. Although these first two theories may sound the same, there are some important distinctions. Self-monitoring refers to attending to one's own body in a manner consistent with Gabby Wolf's definition of an internal focus of attention. So, it does not include any implements used to perform the action, like clubs, rackets, or bats, which are considered to be an external focus because they are effects one's movements have on the environment. And it also does not depend on skill level. Anyone can adopt an internal focus of attention, whether you are highly experienced at a skill or not. Finally, in the self-monitoring explanation, the performer is using their attention to monitor their movements, not necessarily control them. Execution-focused theory, which is also called explicit monitoring, but I think that name is kind of confusing, was first proposed by Sion Beilock and Tom Carr. It argues that attention is turned inwards towards controlling the component movements of the skill. So, if we use golf as an example, a self-monitoring explanation of missing a putt under pressure would be focusing one's attention on the force felt in the hands during the putting stroke, while an example of an execution-focused explanation would be attending to and taking explicit control over the backswing of the club, which is normally proceduralized and automatic. So in execution-focused theory, attending to an implement like a club is bad, because it is part of the component action. Furthermore, execution-focused theory predicts a skill level difference. One cannot explicitly control a movement component that normally runs automatically unless you've practiced enough to have it made run automatically in the first place. So, an execution focus under pressure of this type can only occur in expert performers. The final theory in the turning inwards camp is reinvestment theory proposed by Rich Masters. This is very similar to execution-focused theory, but goes into more detail about the specifics of how attention takes over control of the component movements. Namely, it proposes that the automatic procedures are replaced by step-by-step execution which follows the explicit instructions and knowledge the performer was given or they learned when first acquiring the skill. So, this theory critically argues that choking cannot occur where there was no explicit task knowledge acquired when the skill was learned, or in other words, the learning was implicit. Another way to think about these turning inwards theories is that they involve the inappropriate intervention of awareness or top-down control. Because the stakes are so high, the performer is adding something extra to skill execution that does not need to be there, and is ironically making things worse.
Ooh. That's right. Oh. And that's water. And just like that, 5 shots gone.
Instead of adding something extra to skill execution under pressure, the turning outwards camp argue that something important is being taken away from it. This can come in 2 basic forms: distracting the performer from task-relevant information, or overloading their cognitive resources, so they do not have the attentional or working memory capacity to perform the task as they normally do. So, if not focusing on the execution of the skill under pressure, what is it that the athlete is paying attention to that is causing choking according to these theories? Well, there are basically 3 different ideas that have been proposed here. The original distraction theory proposed by Wine in 1971 argued that it is worrying thoughts or negative emotions that were being focused on instead of the task. These emotions and thoughts compete for working memory resources that are being used to perform the sports skill. More recently, attentional control theory proposed by Eysenck and colleagues argues that it is threatening stimuli in the environment which attract the performer's attention in a bottom-up fashion, resulting in a decrease in top-down, goal-directed attention. Finally, ironic processes theory argues that under pressure, a performer's conscious attention shifts to previously suppressed, unconscious thoughts about perceptual-motor processes that will result in failure to perform the task successfully. For example, thoughts about hitting the ball into a water hazard in golf. So in all of these cases, the problem is not that the performer is trying too hard or over-controlling the action. It's actually the opposite. They are not paying enough attention to action execution due to stimuli that are distracting and or overloading their cognitive resources. So, without getting into all the details, which of these 2 camps is correct according to research evidence? Well, as I also discussed in episode 11, for sports skills, the bulk of the research seems to support the turning inwards camp. There are basically 4 lines of evidence in support. First, skill-focused instructions, like keep the knees bent, as well as skill-focused dual tasks, for example, saying when the movement is finished, damage the performance of experts in a manner highly similar to choking under pressure effects. So in other words, artificially inducing a turning inwards of attention produces choking-like behaviors. This effect does not occur for instructions and tasks which focus a performer's attention on external, non-skill-related stimuli. The second piece of evidence comes from my research showing that expert performers struggling under pressure tend to be better at making judgments about the execution of a skill and worse at making judgments about external stimuli than normal, suggesting that their attention is turned inwards, which I've shown in a few different studies now. The third piece of evidence comes from looking at how performance actually changes during a choking event. As predicted by both execution focus and reinvestment theories, there is evidence that choking under pressure involves a regression to an earlier stage of skill acquisition. Or in other words, experts start acting like novices. This has been shown using movement kinematics and eye movements, for example. The final piece of evidence comes from the fact that distractors and external secondary tasks actually have been successfully used as interventions to prevent choking. Sounds like a pretty ironclad story, right? Well, maybe not. Over the past few years, there have been some important issues raised with the turning inwards accounts of choking under pressure, including some detailed critiques of the research evidence. So let's look at these in a little more detail. As you will see, in responding to these, I'm going to express a lot of my own personal opinions, for 2 reasons. A lot of the critiques are directed at my own work, and second, I'm pretty confident I can do a good job representing the general ideas of the turning inwards camp.
Blair Walsh from 27 yards left hash. Snap good, spot down, Walsh's kick is up, and it is no good, he missed it! Are you kidding me? The season can't end like that!
Critique number 1. Expert level performance is not best characterized as being fully automatic. There are several instances where cognition intervenes beneficially, so a disruption of automaticity due to attention turning inwards cannot be the cause of a performance decline under pressure. It has been argued by some that elite performance cannot be fully automatic, because it wouldn't allow adaptability to changes in conditions, nor would it allow for technique change or refinement. There is also a general dislike by many of the idea that athletes are mindless robots running around the field not thinking about anything they do. Well, I think there are two different levels to this argument. First, it could be possible that the idea of automaticity in performance is completely flawed, and conscious cognition is heavily involved in the control of actions. I personally doubt it, but I will cover this possibility in more detail in a future episode. For example, the mesh theory proposed by Christensen and colleagues. The second possibility is that we haven't been specific enough about where, when, and how attention turns inwards in our theories of choking. For example, although maybe I haven't made it clear enough in my writing, I do not for 1 minute believe that expert performance is mindless. Conscious reflection and attention is essential during gameplay for many things, including planning, strategy, and high-level decision-making. In my opinion, it's just not necessary and actually detrimental for the control of body movements while performing a well-learned skill. So, a point guard dribbling up the floor needs to be consciously processing perceptual information about the movements of players and planning a play, but in my opinion, they don't want to consciously think about where to move their hand next to dribble the ball, or where to position their hands on the ball to make a bounce pass. These things need to run automatically. I also don't agree with the idea that if these types of movements are controlled automatically, they are not adaptable to changes in our environment. Adaptability does not require conscious control and attention. There are numerous processes, for example running or walking over uneven terrain, that are highly functional and adaptable without the involvement of this type of high-level cognitive intervention. So when I say attention to skill execution, I'm only referring to the component bodily movements of a well-learned skill like a dribble, putt, throw, etc. Not every aspect of the skill. So I agree that expert performance is not best characterized as being fully automatic, only a small part of it is. Similarly, even if we focus on attending to the component bodily movements of a well-learned skill, I have never argued that this is always a bad thing for an expert performer. There are several situations when it is beneficial and necessary in sports. These include making technique changes and refinements in practice, adjusting to a new piece of equipment, and recovering from an injury. But I still strongly believe that it is not a good thing when we consider just execution during competition, which is of course when choking occurs. The final point I will concede here is that I agree that there is some subtlety to how a performer tends to things related to skill execution, with not all of the ways of doing it being harmful. For example, research by people like Hardy and Mullen and Carson and Collins have shown that when you use a holistic cue to direct a performer's attention to their bodily movements, there is no negative effect on performance. As I discussed back in episode 40A, holistic cues summarize the entirety of a movement, for example, using the word smooth or an auditory rhythm cue. Critique number 2. The turning inwards theories of choking cannot explain why only some performers choke and only on some occasions. If pressure leads to self-consciousness, leads to explicit attentional control, leads to the disruption of automaticity, why doesn't this happen to every athlete all the time? I think this is a fair point that I've tried to consider more in my recent research. For example, if you look at the early studies by Bylock and Carr and my 2004 baseball batting study, they include group-level analyses of performance, which show significant effects. So really, in both of our studies, you could say everyone choked. This is of course not what occurs in real play, so what's going on? A first possibility that I will address in more detail in a second is that the pressure manipulations used in these studies and the definitions of what counts as choking may not be representative of what occurs in real sports. But I think an even more plausible explanation is that the analyses used in these studies were not designed to pick up individual differences that were most likely there. In my more recent studies, for example, the golf putting study I did with Sarah Williams and John Alsop in 2013, the baseball batting study John and I published in 2013, and the golf putting study I published with Ruan Canal Brulin in 2015, we did find large individual differences in the response to pressure, with some of our participants choking and some not. While we were able to identify some differences between groups in terms of kinematics, attentional focus, and perception, we still have work to do to figure out the causal mechanisms for what determines who chokes and who doesn't. I think a promising approach to this that is missing from theories of choking I've been talking about today is to include the transactional theory of stress into these models. As I've discussed a few times now, the work of researchers like Mark Wilson, Lee Moore, and Sam Vine has shown that how we interpret a stressful situation, as a threat or a challenge, can heavily influence reactions such as increased self-consciousness. I'll be talking more about this in my next episode when I look at a theory by Vine and colleagues that attempts to integrate these things. So, in a nutshell, I don't think individual differences are a deal breaker for turning inwards theories of choking. We just need to make sure to continue to do more individual level analyses and do future research to understand when this turning inwards occurs and for which athletes. Critique number 3, contrary evidence. You may have noticed that when evaluating the research evidence a few moments ago, I said the bulk of it supports turning inwards theories. That, of course, means not all. As I discussed back in episode 11, qualitative studies by researchers such as Raoul Odegenes and Denise Hill seem to provide contradictory results, with most athletes being interviewed reporting distracting and worrying thoughts during choking episodes rather than attention to skill execution. You can obviously guess which side I come down on, but I think it's up to you to decide which you place more weight on: the subjective, retrospective reports of athletes, or the controlled, experimental manipulations that may be less ecological. Both of them have their limitations. I will touch on this issue more in a minute. There have also been suggestions that work using non-sporting type tasks seems to contradict the turning inwards theories of choking. For example, the study by DeCaro and colleagues in 2011. However, for me, I think how pressure influences tasks without a complex movement component, for example, failing a math test, should be considered as a different category and may have different explanations. Critique number 4. Existing theories of choking do not take into account how established the skill is. Carson and colleagues have proposed that we should be considering whether or not a skill is highly established or not when discussing pressure effects. For them, being established includes both movement automaticity and confidence in the performer that their skill is locked away and anxiety-proofed. I don't actually see a real problem for the turning inwards theories here. We just again perhaps need to be more specific in the details of our study. I'm pretty confident that the experts I used in my studies have had fully established skills. Studying pressure effects with quote-unquote non-established athletes is difficult for many reasons. For example, you have to worry about possible floor effects on performance. But I do of course agree they are likely to respond very differently, and it's something we should investigate more in future studies.
That's the big one right there.
This is to tie.
Well, he should have a good rhythm. He's made 2.
Third one's up. No.
Critique number 5. Specific problems with research studies. For this, I want to go through several of the issues raised in a really well-written article by Wayne Christensen and colleagues published in 2015. This article does an excellent job of laying out the specific predictions of the different attentional theories of choking, then proceeds to go through a very detailed analysis of the Bylock and Carr 2000 golf putting study and my 2004 baseball batting study. I have to admit this paper was actually a challenge for me to read because it's so heavily focused on my work. My name appears over 30 times in the article. On the one hand, it is humbling that people care enough to evaluate my work to this degree, but it's also a little scary too. Something that's a little bit disappointing is that the authors of this review did not discuss any of the relevant work I've published after my 2004 paper, which has addressed many of the issues they raised. So, note all of these points I'm going to talk about are in relation to the Bylock and Carr 2001 and Gray 2004 studies. So here goes. Study problem number 1. The distraction conditions used in these studies do not provide a fair test of all turning outwards theories, because the tasks used were overly simplistic and involved stimuli without any threat or emotional significance. So, in Sion's study, the distraction task involved listening for particular words in an auditory stream, while mine involved judging whether an auditory tone was high or low. Christensen and colleagues argue that since these sounds are completely irrelevant to the task, they really only address the possibility of working memory overload. They don't address the possibility that attention could be drawn away to threatening or ironic stimuli, as the other turning outwards theories propose. Thus, the distraction conditions used in these studies may have not hurt performance because the performers simply increased their effort to handle both tasks easily. I think this is a fair point that I've started to address more in some of my recent research. For example, in an aviation study, John Alsop and I found that when threatening external stimuli were present, the runway you could crash into, the response to pressure in terms of eye movements and attentional control was consistent with the predictions of attentional control theory. Also, in a study I just published with Anders Orn and Tim Woodman, we found that the addition of an ironic stimulus, specifically a zone where a pitcher was told the batter hit really well, changed the pattern of behavior under pressure from what would be predicted based on execution focus theory to the predictions of ironic processes, a turning outwards theory. So I agree that research needs to be done using different distracting stimuli that have more significance to the task and the performer. As I will discuss in the next episode in this series, I think the response to pressure will depend somewhat on the nature of the task and the information available to the performer. Study problem number 2. These experiments do not actually provide direct causal tests of the specific predictions of the turning inwards theories. To reiterate, the basic execution focus theory really involves 4 parts. 1. Pressure-induced self-consciousness in a performer. 2. Self-consciousness directs attention to skill execution in an attempt to explicitly control the movement. 3. Attention to skill execution disrupts movement automaticity, which impairs performance. And 4. All of this together is responsible for choking. Christensen and colleagues propose that research has only convincingly demonstrated number 3. That is, attention to skill execution impairs expert performance. But they argue there's not much of any evidence for the other parts. In their review, Christensen and colleagues argue that the only evidence for pressure leading to skill-focused attention comes from my 2004 finding that the ability to make skill-focused judgments improves under pressure, while the ability to perform an external secondary task gets worse. They further point to the fact that this is only correlational, and it's possible that attention to execution, resulting in the improved judgments I found, was caused by the performance decline, not the other way around. So perhaps performance got worse first, then the batters in my study started attending to their swing to fix things. In other words, my 2004 study does not establish a causal effect. As I mentioned earlier, I think this point has been addressed by some of the research I've conducted since my 2004 study. First, I would note that I've replicated this basic effect a few times. For example, in my 2015 golf putting study, we found that pressure resulted in an improved ability to make judgments about club movement during putting, and a decline in the ability to make judgments about the position of a sound relative to the whole. Furthermore, we showed that these attentional effects were linked to performance, because we found that the change in secondary task performance only occurred for golfers that putted worse under pressure. For those that maintained performance, there was no change. To address the issue of causality, I would point to the 2013 study that John Alsop and I conducted looking at performance streaks in baseball batting. In experiment 2 of this study, we used similar secondary tasks to the one I used in my 2004 study. Following a long series of at-bats, we categorized hitters into 3 groups relative to their baseline performance: normal, cold streak, or hot streak. Furthermore, we found that the attentional focus was different for these 3 groups. Namely, the cold streak batters were better at judging bat movement than the other 2 groups. So I do agree with Christensen's proposal that a decline in performance can lead to skill-focused attention. However, this study also included a 1 at-bat pressure condition. What we found was that performance in the pressure condition depended on the focus of attention beforehand. So the direction of causality was from attentional focus to performance, not the other way around under pressure. I also feel that other situations that we have shown lead to focus on skill execution, such as during technique change and following injury, provide secondary evidence for this. Finally, in splitting the secondary task performance under pressure into halves, we were able to show that attentional change seems to lead performance changes under pressure. The other criticism raised by Christensen and colleagues in terms of mechanisms is that we can't really know for sure that we are actually studying the choking phenomenon. This is a point that I discussed back in episode 26A in my interview with Denise Hill. It is very likely that in the lab we're investigating underperformance rather than true choking. Are these things on a continuum or really qualitatively different? I think we still need more work to understand degrees of performance failure. One point that I would make that was ignored a bit in the reviews is that the performance declines I have found in my baseball batting studies are pretty substantial in magnitude, so they're not just slight underperformance. So, to sum this point up, we are still continually working to provide direct causal evidence for the different aspects of the choking theories. It just takes time to tease this all apart. Study problem number 3. These studies lack ecological validity and are not good representations of choking situations in real sports. Specific points raised by Christensen and colleagues include the unusual context in our study. For example, participants are grouped as teams with others to create pressure, the low difficulty and monotony of the tasks, and the fact that the focus of attention used are dissimilar to anything a performer would really do in real sports. I have to admit I was a bit irked when I saw this point. On the one hand, in the previous point, my research was critiqued for not providing direct causal tests of specific predictions. And then on the other, it's critiqued for not being representative and ecological of real tasks. To me, expecting both of these criteria to be met at once is completely unrealistic. It's serving 2 masters and reminds me a lot of the annoying reviews I've received over the years. We need to approach the issue of choking from both sides, studying it in the wild and reducing it down in the lab. We can't do both at once. But anyways, to address some of the specific concerns, I don't think that the tasks I've used in my batting studies have been dull or too easy. In most cases, our participants find them very challenging. The baseline performance before pressure was applied is often a batting average of 250. So it's not like they're just hitting a ball off a tee successfully every time. Furthermore, as I mentioned with a study I did with John Alsop, we have also collected pressure data when the performer has only 1 at-bat to complete, just like would occur in a real game, and a crowd was present. In terms of the secondary tasks we use, again, it's hard to design ones that are similar to what might actually occur in real sport and still make them quantifiable and comparable. In my research, I wanted to try and achieve a compromise between the two. So, I picked something that I thought is important and a performer might want to focus their attention on, specifically the timing of the different subcomponents of their movement. However, I didn't want to just ask them to focus on this and hope for the best. So I used the auditory prompt. I also liked this design because it meant the stimuli presented to the participants was identical in all conditions. The only thing that changed was what I had them do in response to it. A final point that I will make that applies to this and some of the other criticisms is that I think there's still a lot of confusion out there between continuously controlling a movement based on perceptual information and explicitly controlling a movement using top-down attention. Just because a performer's movements are responsive to perceptual information does not require that they be consciously attending to them. So, to sum up, I think some of the critiques raised in these recent articles are valid and important. While some can be addressed by having more specificity in our theories and models of choking under pressure, others will require more research with creative ways of bringing this interesting phenomenon into the lab. Okay, that's it for today's episode. If you're interested in this topic, there are a couple other things you might want to check out that I've linked in the show notes. The first is a preprint of a book chapter on choking that I recently wrote in collaboration with Max Capuccio, Chris Masogno, Denise Hill, and Tom Carr, which touches on a lot of the same issues I talked about today. The second is a recent vlog I did in which I demo some of the dual tasks that I've used in my research, including the 2004 study I talked about in detail today. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, part 2 in my series of attentional theories on choking, looking at the integrative theories. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter at ShakyWeights. And to find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.